Good evening. I want to give a big thank you to Sharmili Majmudar
You got
and
it.
thank her for joining us from Women Employed, who um, do a lot of work in the women's rights area. And since this was a month where we were looking at women's wages, the International Women's March, and a number of other women's rights type holidays and events. I thought this would be a good month for us to have someone come speak to us about an ongoing problem for women, and that is the working women and the existing wage gap. Sharmili, if you don't mind giving us a little bit of your background and then go right ahead and share your presentation and feel free to get started.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you for having me today. We've worked alongside the league for many years. So really happy to be with folks with shared goals and values. I am Sharmili Majmudar. I'm the Executive Vice President of Policy Programs and Research at Women Employed. Um, I've been at the organization for 8 years. Previous to coming to Women Employed, I was the executive director of what was then Rape Victim Advocates and is now known as Resilience. And prior to that, I was at Sarah's Inn. That's what Cynthia was referencing. My background is primarily in gender justice. Most of those years have been in gender-based violence related work, so working on domestic and sexual violence. And then, of course, coming over to Women Employed and working on women's economic justice issues. For me, that was very aligned, particularly in doing gender-based violence work. You really understand how deeply the issue of economics are woven into the experience of survivors and really what options they have available to them, and sometimes what forces them to continue to have to stay in abusive situations or prevent them from leaving those situations. And economic abuse itself is such a critical um, tactic that is used by partners who are abusive as well. Um, for me, it was very much there's continuity going from gender-based violence work to going to economic equity work for women as well. Um, so in my role, I oversee all of our legislative and systems related policy work. I oversee our innovative programming work, which is usually um, focused on higher education and career pathways, and then our research work as well. Women Employed itself is a small but mighty team. We have I think now we have 23 full-time staff. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Women Employed in a minute, but wanted to share that. Kathy, thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself. And I've also had the opportunity to go to different league chapters and speak primarily about pay equity, actually, and as well as the league conferences as well. So it definitely feels like we're among friends. Um, it is a Zoom meeting, so please feel free to use the chat or come off mute. I don't want you to feel like you have to stand on formality. I do have a presentation. I'm going to share that with you. You can save questions for the end. We will have some time for Q&A, but you also don't have to wait until the end, especially if there's something that I'm sharing that you have a question about as well. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and dig in. And Kathy, if you don't mind, sometimes when I'm sharing slides, it can be difficult to see the chat. So if you could flag for me if I, miss a question or anything like that. Thank you.
Great, I've got it up. Yep.
Awesome. All right. So I wanted to give you an overview of what it is that we'll cover today. I'm going to share a little bit more about the state of the gender wage gap, talk about recent trends and updates in the law, particularly in Illinois, but also give you kind of a national backdrop to that as well. Share a lot of, we have a number of know your rights resources, and our we always talk about how important it is not only to pass public policy, but to make sure that people understand it and understand how they can access the rights, protections, guarantees, and benefits that are included in those policies as well. So we consider Know Your Rights being just as much part of our policy work as pushing in the legislature. I'm going to talk also about other policies that advance pay equity that aren't on their face, kind of quote unquote equal pay policies, and then we'll do Q&A. So about women employed, we've been around since 1973, so we're a little over 50 years old. And if you think about every economic advance that has been made for women since 1973, women employed has been involved. We have really focused on pursuing equity for women in the workforce, and we do so through policy change, expanding access to educational opportunities. We've advocated for fair, equitable, and inclusive workplaces so that women can thrive, and by extension, families and communities can thrive as well. And our mission is to improve the economic status of women and remove barriers to economic equity. Our mission, as I already said, but our full social goal, and this is kind of the moment that we're in, that we've been in with our current strategic plan, has been to grow the economic power of women in Illinois, especially those in low or unpaid work, and Black and Latinx, Latina women, and to do our part to close the wealth gap that exists at the intersection of race and gender. We are very proudly Chicago and Illinois based and Chicago and Illinois focused. But we also understand how important local and state work is in influencing, guiding, and showing what's possible at the federal level as well. So let's just kind of level set around where we are with the gender wage gap. So you may know that March 25th, next week, is Equal Pay Day. Um, how the wage gap is calculated is usually based on the earnings of the full year, not the most immediate past, but the one before that. So we base our wage gap calculations on 2023 earnings because that is the most recent earnings data that we have incomplete and are able to analyze. So in 2023, on average, women earned just 83% of what men earned, based on looking at median weekly earnings for full-time workers. Um, I think it's really critical when we're looking at the gender wage gap that we actually, though, expand beyond full-time year-round workers and talk about part-time and full-time workers. And when you do that, you see that the wage gap is even larger. Women made just 75 cents for every dollar a man made. The reason that we talk about both is because traditionally it used to be calculated only on the basis of full-time year-round workers. However, women very often are pushed into choosing part-time jobs because they are bearing the largest responsibility for caregiving and have to arrange their schedules around those caregiving responsibilities that often forces them to go into a part-time job or multiple part-time jobs. So if we stop looking at part-time jobs and we only look at full-time, we're actually leaving out a disproportionate number of women. And that is particularly true for women of color and mothers. So by including part-time workers in the calculation, we are actually just casting a wider net, and we would argue getting a more accurate picture of what the situation around earnings actually is. What else about the wage gap? Well, so a couple of years ago, there was an analysis of students receiving federal financial aid and looking at what their earnings were like right after leaving college. And it found that the gender wage gap starts within 3 years of graduating college. Now, there's other data that suggests that it starts with the kind of like immediately after graduating college. And there's other data that shows that the gap starts as soon as children begin to receive allowances. So I want to pause there for a second. We have a small enough group here. So I feel like I can ask everybody to say a little bit, or raise your hands. Did any of you receive allowances that were connected to chores that you did at home? Or have you given your children allowances based on that? So I see a few hands. Um, yeah, I see a few other hands. Okay. Laura, Owen, can you share a little bit about your experience? Was that about yours or your children's?
Well, it happened for me as a child. That was part of um, a sort of family dynamic
Yeah.
among all our children, all the kids in our family. Um, we gave our two children allowances, but I wouldn't say it was necessarily tied with chores.
Okay.
So slightly different format.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. Anyone else?
Shannon, I don't know if that was you that had your hand up or not. I just see a league sign. Did you have a thought on that as well? Sounds like she's off. Okay.
Okay. That's okay. So the reason that we kind of say that allowances. Oh, Jen, did you want to say something? No? Okay. So the reason that we ask about, I'm asking you about kind of your experience related to allowances is because a lot of people do actually give their children allowances, or they connect those allowances to the chores that the children are assigned. And in this day and age, there are apps that help you do that. There's one called Busy Kids. There's a couple of others that are ways for parents to um, divvy up the money, to give money through the app, to track the chores the kids are doing, etc. And what we see through and what happens with that is then we collect data, right? There's data to be analyzed on kind of like who's doing what, how much money are they getting, that kind of thing. And and I'm going to speak in this in a gender binary way because that's the way they collect data. um, Boys routinely would receive 20 to 30% more in their allowances than girls. And if you think about it, um, there's also like well, let me back up for a second. What are the typical, and this will be very gendered, what are the typical chores that boys are assigned? You can put it in the chat, you can come off mute.
Cutting grass, right? Maybe
Cutting
washing
grass.
the car. I don't know.
Hmm.
Shoveling the driveway.
Taking out trash, right? Recyclables, maybe compost, depending on where you are, right? They maybe cleaning up the yard. um they tend to be outdoor, tend to be more physical manual labor, right? What kinds of chores do girls typically get assigned?
Dishes, vacuuming, right?
Joella, were you going to say something?
Well, it helps when you only have girls because then there really is no difference.
Or only boys.
Or only boys.
Yeah.
Or only boys. So when you see families that do have boys and girls, you tend to see boys doing more of the manual labor that's outdoors, it's dirty, and girls doing a lot of household labor that can also be very manual and dirty, I will say, right? But it's things like cleaning the dishes, taking care of younger siblings, doing the laundry, babysitting, the things that we think of as household work, care work also. And so what we see kind of like when we're thinking about what children receive in their allowances, that is connected to the kinds of chores that they do and the gap that we see there, we really see that gap then ripple out in the rest of our society. Because if you think about what the equivalents are, right? You think about construction work versus childcare, and you look at what the earnings are when you're thinking about how construction work is valued and compensated versus how childcare is valued and compensated. So we start at a very young age teaching children that the value of household work, of care work, is less than the value of the kinds of manual labor or labor that boys or men do, as well. And I did not know anything about this difference in chores and allowances, but it kind of made sense when we think about how our society is structured. That's a very good point, Joella. There's something that there's the work that girls do is like sustaining the household. And so it has a great deal of regularity to it. All right. So, like trying to get back to my presentation. Hang on. There we go. Um, so when we add race into the equation, we find even more differentials into the gender wage gap. So these are also based on 2023 earnings data. So this is what women make compared to every dollar a white man makes. And as you can see, when you talk about all earners, and that's including part-time earners, we have a range of making as little as 51 cents on the dollar for Latina women, all the way up to 83 cents for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women. Now, one thing I will point out to you here is that when you split Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women from the bigger category of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, that gap grows significantly. So you can see that here, 61 cents for all earners. Now, we talk about the gender wage gap in terms of how it intersects with race. It also intersects with other things, like there is a mom's equal pay day. And based on 2023 earnings data, moms make 62 cents for all earners for every dollar that a white man makes. There is not enough data for us to do really good analysis of the experience of LGBTQ folks, but there is an LGBTQIA Equal Pay Awareness Day. There's also some analysis around women with disabilities who make 56 cents on every dollar that a white man makes. So there are many other issues that you can intersect when talking about the gender wage gap to give you a better picture or a more complex picture of how the gender wage gap plays out for different people. Now, we talk about this in terms of pennies, right? This is like how many cents on the dollar, but that adds up. And it adds up quickly. So when we're talking about how much then is lost over a 40-year career, and I will note that these numbers are based on 2023 earnings data, excuse me, as well as some 2022. But it still stands that you're talking about losing close to $200,000 over a 40-year career to well over $1.2 million. And what are these dollars? What do they mean? They mean the difference between buying a house, being able to go to college, being able to send your kids to college, being able to buy a car, making decisions about where it is that you can live, making decisions about whether or not your family can go on vacation. Like that is what's represented, right? When we look at these numbers, this is about kind of what groceries you can get, whether you're having to decide at any given time between rent and electricity, and putting food on the table. These are, so it's, yes, we talk about it in terms of dollars and cents, but it really, really adds up. And then you add age into the picture. And one of the things that I don't think is talked about enough is that as women age, the gender wage gap grows. Women in their 50s tend to experience pay plateaus. That is the highest earning potential that they will have. Men, their earning potential continues to grow after the age of 50. So we see a gender wage gap for women in their late 40s, mid 50s, that is even larger than what the wage gap was when they first got out of college as well. Why does this matter? Beyond that probably ticks you off. um, it matters because income equality is fueled in part by the gender wage gap, which means that it is a significant contributor to wealth inequality. And that impacts everything from debt, certainly student debt. We know that 2/3 of all student debt is held by women. Um, what educational avenues women are taking, and then what that debt burden is for those educational avenues. Home ownership, and it perpetuates itself over generations. And as you probably know, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times that of a Black family. So it really is important that we're looking not only at gender, but that we're using the lens of looking at gender and race, gender and age, those kinds of things. And on average, working women lost more than $1.6 trillion in 2022 as a consequence of the wage gap. So what have we been doing related to that? How do we fix it, right? Um, there have been a number of really impactful pieces of legislation that have been passed over the last 5 or 6 years. So, equal pay legislation has been introduced in over 2/3 of the states, many municipalities as well since 2019. Um, Many of these are also really, the practices themselves are evidence based. They have been studied and they've been shown to close gender and racial wage gaps, and they make an impact on individual lives, families, but then it also benefit local economies because we know that women spend a lot of money locally. That is where they spend. And so when they have money to spend, they are spending that in their communities. And so they are therefore boosting the local economy as well. Now, most recent among these victories have been salary transparency laws. And of course, ours in Illinois went into effect in January 2025. But I'm going to talk about the full category of pay equity laws that have been passed in the last several years. So there have been salary history bans, protecting pay discussions, similar work. I'll explain what that means, closing loopholes, increasing relief for victims, some really interesting legislation around pay data, and then finally pay or salary transparency. So protecting worker discussion of pay, it's really difficult to even know that you are being paid inequitably if you are not able to talk about it, right? And fear of retaliation, and employers, whether explicitly or implicitly discouraging or prohibiting such discussion, means that we have a lot of risk of pay disparities going unrecognized and unaddressed. Illinois had already protected employees from retaliation for discussing their pay, but we also passed an amendment to the Illinois Equal Pay Act, which made it illegal for employers to require an employee to sign a contract or any kind of waiver that would prohibit an employee from discussing their compensation. There are some limitations, like if you're someone who's like an HR employee and you have access to sensitive, pay data, you can't like go around telling everybody what other people make or anything like that, unless that's how your workplace is set up. So this is important. And I should say that this is also built in to the National Labor Relations Act, which is why the ways in which the current administration has paralyzed the National Labor Relations Board, one of the many reasons that that is problematic. So what do we mean by equal pay for similar work and skill, and why that doesn't sound as like snappy as equal pay for equal work, right? So equal pay for equal work has been a really effective way, like it's an effective slogan. Everyone knows what it means, right? It can be very mobilizing, and it's been really useful to galvanize understanding and action. As a legal standard, it's been less successful because a lot of courts have very narrowly interpreted what it means when you say equal work, equal pay. And so there have been courts and judges who have been like, well, you don't have exactly the same title, so it's not equal work. Or you have minor differences in your job responsibilities, so it's not equal work. And so by saying similar work and skill, we're allowing for um, people to get relief when the employer might be kind of like getting around the necessity of paying equally for a work that's so similar. So if you can think about like a janitor versus a hotel housekeeper, right? Both doing cleaning, both doing very physical work, both kind of having responsibility across kind of like a building, that kind of thing. There really shouldn't that would be an example of potentially substantially similar work as well. And so there can be a fairer basis of comparing the compensation. There's closing loopholes. You know, employers will sometimes be like, well, yes, they're getting paid differently, but it's not because of gender. It's because of something else. And so there used to be a lot more room to be able to argue that it was something else. Now that something else has been narrowed down, you really have to justify what that something else is. And it has to be job related and based on the position. It has to be consistent with business necessity, and it has to account for the entire differential. So if you were paying someone $10,000 more, and really whatever that differential is only explains $2,000, it's not going to cut it. It has to explain all of that $10,000. Then we also have to make sure that laws have enough teeth and that actually help make people whole. So there was an amendment to the Illinois Equal Pay Law that guarantees that victims of pay discrimination can recover, are not limited to just recovering back pay, like what they were owed, but they can also receive compensatory punitive damages and injunctive relief as well. And then collecting and recording. So this is we're in a very interesting and somewhat treacherous time as it relates to pay data, because most pay data is collected through the EEO-1, which is submitted to the EEOC. There's reason to believe that the new administration may just say we don't need to collect that wage data anymore. We're not going to analyze it anymore. Now, most states do not collect that kind of pay data. Illinois is one of only 2 states in the country that has a law that it actually requires private employers to submit their pay data. So why is it important to collect data? First of all, we have to have data in order to understand the problem, right? But it also helps, it really pushes employers to analyze their own internal pay equity. It provides an opportunity to address any gaps. It also helps law enforcement agencies, and it helps to target kind of what the law enforcement agencies are doing, right? So the Illinois Department of Labor, for example, can be like, huh, we're seeing like a lot of different pay differentials from the data that's being submitted in a particular industry or in a particular geography. And so they can go then to those industries or geographies and say, let's look at what's going on here and let's help you get to a place where you're ensuring that you're actually paying fairly. The law requires that private employers with more than 100 employees in Illinois obtain an equal pay registration certificate. They have to file an application that includes some certifications and disclosures. They have to include their most recent EEO-1 report. So this is where the intersection is with the federal. And they also have to submit a list of all the employees in the past calendar year categorized by gender and race and ethnicity with corresponding wages so that they are actually analyzing, right? Like these are the job titles, these are the people, this is how much they're getting paid, this is how we're understanding kind of what the ranges are. That doesn't mean everyone has to get paid exactly the same, but you should definitely be making intentional decisions around how you are compensating people that is based in experience, in skills, in merit, not based in unintentional or intentional bias.
Sharmili, there's a question in the
Oh, yeah.
in the chat here, if I can interrupt for a second.
Oh, about the business necessity. I can
Yeah,
send
is this
something as
stuff
a
just
follow-up.
yeah, I was just wondering if this is something that's just sort of been randomly kind of buried in EEOC law someplace, or are there
So
just
that's Illinois
places
law.
where okay.
Yeah, so it's not just Illinois law, it's in other states as well, but I can do that as part
Send a
of the
follow-up?
follow-up.
Okay,
Mhm.
perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Um, and then we have salary transparency, which is the newest law that we have in Illinois. And as of January, we joined 10 other states across the country. And there are, in fact, 3 more states that are going to be joining the ranks of salary transparency. I see the question in the chat. Sorry, the 2 states that for the pay data reporting are Illinois and California. So the new law is an amendment, also an amendment to the Illinois Equal Pay Act. It requires the businesses of 15 employees or more have to include the information about the expected pay range, expected benefits, and other compensation that they will offer in any job opportunity that they post. Employers also have to let their current employees know when they're looking for external candidates for a position that would be an opportunity for promotion as well. So those are kind of the big kind of core pieces of this law. Why does salary transparency matter? Well, I know we skipped over, and I'm so sorry. I think we skipped over the no salary history ban. The salary history ban, which we championed in 2019, and we tried 3 times. It got vetoed twice, and then finally got signed into law by Pritzker. The salary history ban basically says you can't ask me if I'm applying for a job what I'm making right now or what I've made in the past. And the idea is that it will just compound. It's like the opposite of compound interest, right? It's like a compound deficit. It's like if I already got paid 10% less in my last job, and you're using that as a way to determine how much you're going to offer me in this job, then I am continuing to compound this gap, right? Every new job should be compensated on the basis of what are the skills, knowledge, experience, qualifications, and budget that you have related to that job. I might be applying for a job in a completely different field. My salary should not be based on what I was making before, right? So salary transparency from our perspective is kind of like the sister policy, because if you're not asked about if you're not asked about what you're making, you do get asked how much you want to make. And It's very hard to answer that question if you don't have information, right? When employers aren't transparent about pay, gender and racial gaps widen, and women and people of color in particular lose out. Studies show that job applicants are when job applicants are given a range, that provides them context for their negotiations. And that means kind of like what the playing field is, right? It gives you a context for negotiation not only of compensation, but also of benefits, whether there are any workplace conditions that are negotiable, like flexibility, remote work, hybrid, etc. Um, and when you give that kind of context, the gender and racial wage gap narrows. There have been a number of studies that show that. Not only this, but if you don't provide your job, the salary on a job posting, what you end up doing is wasting a lot of time because you get candidates whose pay expectations are not within the range of what you can pay. And you have people who are going through interview after interview after interview, and then finding out at the very end when they get the offer that this is not within the realm of what they are considering, right? We're seeing a real generational difference in terms of the expectations around salary transparency as well. Younger workers have an expectation that they will know what the salary range is. And in fact, when they don't see a salary range, they see that as suspect. They see that as a reason to mistrust. 85% of workers are more likely to apply for a job if the pay range is included. 85% of college grads are less likely to apply for a job if the salary range is not posted. The response time for job ads that have salary ranges included is 50% faster than those who don't. And when you do include salary ranges, those job postings get 67% more applications. You have a better talent pool, and you are likely to be able to hire more quickly, and someone who actually has expectations that line up with what you're able to provide and see you as trustworthy because you've been transparent. It is absolutely a win-win-win. So we have 11 states that have passed now, including Illinois, salary transparency laws. And there are also multiple municipalities. So New York City, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Toledo, Ithaca, New York, like they're kind of all over the place as well. Now, all these rights are fantastic. We are so happy to have been able to advance these laws. And they really have made a difference. But as I was saying before, if you don't know about them and if you don't know your rights, then you don't know what you have a right to expect. And we don't actually see the impact of the work. So we actually, a few years ago, received we partnered with the Illinois Department of Labor. The Illinois Department of Labor actually received a grant from the Women's Bureau of the US Department of Labor to conduct a statewide campaign to inform people about what equal pay rights were in Illinois, with a particular interest in focusing on women and women of color who often had the least access to accurate information about what their equal pay rights were and how to ensure that those rights were enforced. So we launched the campaign. We set up a webpage, equalpayillinois.org, and we also made sure that it was translated, the resources are translated in the 8 most common languages spoken in Illinois. So English, Spanish, Polish, Korean, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Arabic, and Tagalog. And there's a lot of information on the webpage. There are a lot of frequently asked questions. There's information about state rights. There are also information about federal rights and resources. There are some videos, a whole bunch of resources. And in order to build all of this, we actually worked with a market research firm who interviewed 500 women across Illinois to find out what they knew about their pay rights. And the vast majority of them did not know what their rights were to equal pay. And so that's why we really emphasize this piece very much. If there's only one thing that you take away from today's presentation, I hope it is this: equalpayillinois.org. Because it's not just for us, it's for the young people who are coming up, who are looking for their first jobs. We want to make sure that they understand what their rights are from the get-go as well. Now, other policies that advance equal pay, um, robust workplace harassment and other discrimination protections. Because when you have harassment, you have higher turnover, you have problems with retention, and that can really impact how someone's wages may be increasing or not over the course of their careers. Sometimes people are pushed out of high earning careers, particularly in male dominated fields, and so they miss out, right, on the value of those of that career path. Policies that counter the segregation of women into underpaid work and poverty level minimum wage jobs. So those are things like making sure that um, we are doing a good job of having industries like construction, like manufacturing, like transportation, distribution, and logistics, like IT, that women have paths to those jobs and that those workplaces are prepared and set up not only to welcome them, but to for them to thrive as well. Because it's not just about recruitment, hiring, recruitment, it's about retention and advancement as well. Sub-minimum wage is something that we've been working on. We worked on it here in the city of Chicago, but we also work on it in Illinois. Tipped workers receive only 60% of the minimum wage, and they're expected to make up the rest in tips. There is rampant wage theft. It is very difficult administratively, and it has really pushed women, particularly Black and Brown women, into poverty. And we believe that everyone should just get a minimum wage. That's why it's called minimum. Like, what sub minimum doesn't make sense. Minimum is minimum. No one should get paid less than minimum. And then finally, paid family and medical leave, paid sick and safe days, and caregiver protections. And I'll go into that for a few more minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. What do we have as far as leave policies go in Illinois? Well, we just last year, it went into effect, the Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act, which says that workers can earn up to 40 hours of paid time off to be used for any reason every year. Chicago also has a paid leave ordinance with essentially the same thing. Workers in Chicago, though, as of 2019, could also earn up to 40 hours of paid sick and safe leave. So that is leave that is for specific purposes related to illnesses, doctor's appointments, gender-based violence, emergency school closings, those kinds of things. What we don't have in Illinois, and we do not have in the United States, is paid family and medical leave. And this is one of the things that Women Employed has been championing for the last several years. Paid family and medical leave not only helps to address the gender wage gap, because part of what pushes women out of career paths is their care responsibilities. And instead of being able to come back to their jobs, they have to leave the workforce altogether. And the responsibilities of care still fall overwhelmingly on women's shoulders, even though men have started picking that up more. On top of that, women are often taking care of both children as well as aging or other members of the family who may have disabilities, right? So you hear a lot of times women being in the sandwich generation. At Women Employed, we call it the panini generation because it's not just a sandwich, like there's heat and pressure on both sides as well, right? And you can feel like you're melting down. It also really is important for families' savings and for families' economic stability as well. Mothers are key family breadwinners, and 84% of Black families, 49% of Latinx families, and 48% of white families. Women are breadwinners, full stop. And protecting their ability to continue to provide for their families is really critical to ensuring that families' economic well-being is sustained. 62% of Illinois families can't even take unpaid leave when they need to without risking their jobs or their economic security. So you've heard of the Family Medical Leave Act. It only applies to businesses of 50 and over, and it is unpaid. And most families just cannot afford to take unpaid leave, even if that were an option. So we are leading the Illinois Time to Care Coalition, which is fighting for paid family and medical leave in Illinois. Illinois would not be the first state in the country to have paid family and medical leave. And as I mentioned before, the United States is the only quote unquote developed nation to not have paid family and medical leave. So I'll pause there, and these are like we're kind of like on a whole bunch of social platforms. Definitely encourage you to follow us, go to our website. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. We also have a blog on Medium, and you can also contact me as well. And I will stop there and see we have time for some questions, discussion.
You know, I guess I have two questions, and I suppose they're somewhat related, so you can address them however you like. One is got to do more with the enforceability slash consequences of not complying with these laws. And then the other, I guess, related question is, how big of a threat do you think cutbacks in the EEOC, DEI, things of that nature are going to affect the ability to enforce some of these laws?
Those are great questions, Kathy. As far as enforceability that's built into the laws themselves, it varies. The salary transparency law, which is the most recent one in Illinois, actually built into the legislation very specific fines and consequences for first, second, and third strike. And I think at a level of detail that we don't actually, frankly, often see. And so for some companies, sure, can not doing the right thing kind of like be a cost of doing business for them? Possibly. But I think with salary transparency, as I mentioned, it's becoming an issue of like competitive talent acquisition. Like when your talent wants this information and you're not providing it, you're actually pulling yourself out of the running as an employer. And so I think that, and frankly, this isn't like, yes, we're on the leading edge in Illinois, having passed salary transparency. It's not revolutionary. There were plenty of businesses that already provided salary ranges well before January 1st. Why? Because it works. Because it works for them as companies that are kind of seeking to put themselves in the best possible light when competing for talent. So, so I mentioned that because I think that there's enforcement and then there's consequences, and they're not always the same thing, right? Like enforcement is what we're talking about with the Illinois Department of Labor, where I see a job posting and it doesn't have a salary range, so I send in a complaint to the Illinois Department of Labor to address it. That's what they're going to do. But the consequences of losing out on talent, that doesn't require the Illinois Department of Labor. So that's what I would say about that. From a federal perspective, it's still, so I don't think it's wait and see. Let me be very clear. I think we are already seeing the impacts of the threats that have come out of the White House and the administration. Having said that, there is so much litigation happening right now. Do you know what a legal DEI is? I sure don't. And the administration has not defined it, right? So I think that we also have to understand that the whole reason that DEI, for example, has existed is to ensure that you have well-functioning, productive workplaces. And like ultimately, and that is still a business imperative, regardless of what the White House says. In addition, the law is still the law. And when I say that, I don't mean just the federal law, I also mean state law. And state law is very clear. Like Illinois has very strong state laws and protections in this area, but our federal law is also strong. Now, yes, agencies can, choose how they're going to interpret or enforce those laws. And that's, I think, where we see when you start decimating agencies, I mean, who's going to enforce them, right? There are real questions being raised. And there's also concerns about agencies getting weaponized to in fact do the opposite of what we think of when we think of kind of fairness and opportunity. But the business case has not changed. And in many cases, the law has not either. I do think that we need to shore up what we're doing in Illinois. So for example, the pay data law, it assumes that the company is sending EEO-1 pay data to the feds, and it is the same data that they are then sending to Illinois. We're going to have to look at that to ensure that we're continuing to get that data in Illinois. There are things like that that we have to look at. But I think that we're definitely seeing, concern. We're seeing companies withdrawing, at least from very public affirmations of their kind of DEI work. We're also seeing some companies that are doubling down as well. And I think it's important that we continue to lead with values and what the actual goals are of DEI work, which is about fairness and opportunity. So, yeah.
I do have one more question, but I don't want to dominate if someone else has a question out there as well.
I just wanted to ask a question regarding that connection between the wage gap and growing sort of wealth gaps over people's lives. Maybe just a comment. If you're looking at jobs that have some kind of pension or retirement account associated, where the employer is making some contribution, any difference in pay also translates into differences in contributions. And the question I had about that is, you talked a little bit about some of the legal remedies for discrimination can go beyond recovering back pay. Do we also see that in terms of sort of retirement benefits, things like that being, I don't know where the law is on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can show that there's like a quantifiable harm out of kind of an unjustified wage disparity, that not only like, some companies provide a bonus, for example, or your 401k contribution, to your point, Laura, is calculated on the basis of your earnings, right? Our Social Security benefits are calculated on the basis of our earnings. If we are earning less, we are also getting less out of our Social Security, when it is that we're drawing down on Social Security. But putting that aside for a second, you could, I think that I'm not an attorney and I'm not providing legal advice here, but you can make an argument that any compensation that was tied or impacted to that wage disparity is fair game.
Interesting. So the last question that I had really related more to, because there's clearly a women's pay gap, right? And that's also influenced by other factors. Primarily, it looks like race and parenthood, right? Um, but what you're comparing it to is white men. So I'm wondering if the disparities are more driven by gender, or if they are just sort of equally driven by, if you compared uh Latino men to Latinas, or if you could, if you compared kind of got the noise out of the data, the racial noise out of the data, is it primarily gender driven, or do we still continue to see just basic race disparities across, our
It's
wages?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. So there's disparities, like inter-ethnic disparities and then intra-ethnic disparities as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Sarah, that's absolutely right. And we have to pay more, like, the pink tax, the so-called pink tax, where we're paying more for insurance for some goods. Absolutely. Our work at Women Employed therefore encompasses kind of a really broad range of work. Like, I've focused here on our pay equity and mostly our pay equity policy work, but we also do work on occupational segregation and addressing career paths to high earning jobs. We do a lot of work around sexual harassment and discrimination, because that has costs associated with it as well, and definitely pushes people out of, particularly out of male dominated, high earning jobs. Um, we really see kind of the gender wage gap, as you said, Kathy. It is driven by different things, but many of those things are rooted in how it is that we value women's labor, or more accurately, how we don't value women's labor, whether that is the unpaid care work that women are frequently doing in their households, or whether it is the occupations that women are overrepresented in. There are many ways in which we do not compensate women's labor, in ways that are fair or represent their contributions to our society. And so that's why our work kind of spans in so many different ways, because we really have to tackle it, as a multifaceted problem. Simply having a law that says, well, you have to pay equal pay for equal work is only going to address one facet of how the inequity shows up.
And you think of women, selecting, even though going into college, selecting jobs or educational paths to jobs that might be more favorable to child rearing, or working around the need to have child care, and that's expensive, and things like that as well. So you can really see how it culturally evolves, in addition to just the pay gap piece of it.
And it's true in female dominated professions. When you look at early childhood, men get paid more than women in early childhood work. Men get paid
Crazy,
more than
right?
women in nursing. So it's not like that disappears somehow when you move into female dominated occupations either.
Sarah, I'm glad you took your metal shop classes. They need more guys in home ec on the flip side, right?
Unfortunately,
True.
when I was in middle school, there were very firm rules of gender
Right.
segregation in those classes. But
I think we've come a little ways there. I
yeah,
think we've come a little
hopefully.
ways there. Yeah.
Shamali, can we reach out to you if we're interested in some of the resources? I'd be interested in some of the studies that you were citing information about.
Absolutely.
Because I
Yeah.
teach something in this area, and so I wanted to.
She
Yep.
just put her
Include-
email in the chat, guys, in case you want to.
Okay, great.
Yes, please feel free to reach out. I will follow up with an article regarding the legal requirements related to business necessity versus, an unfair pay differential.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. I know what a busy month this is in particular for your organization, just for starters. But I know, as we were talking before everybody jumped on, it's a little bit of crazy times for many of us on top of that. And so really appreciate your carving out an hour this evening to share this with us. And I know we'll have some other members taking a look at this recording. So thank you much. Thanks for giving us your contact information as well, so that we can do some follow-up, and we'll look forward to maybe another one of these at some point down the road.